Afternoon, everybody. Delighted to welcome you today. My name is Rebecca Pierre and I'm a professional officer at BASWA. Really grateful for you giving up your time to be here today. We appreciate how busy everyone is. And so just to explain the purpose of this webinar very quickly, it is to raise awareness about the impact of domestic abuse on child development and well-being, but also to teach social workers about how to use a tool called Operation Encompass. Liz will go into much more detail, but briefly, it's a multi-agency tool that used to ensure that schools have timely information about all police-attended incidents of domestic abuse, no matter where in the child lives. And in being aware of this tool, it's something that social workers can actively do in their day-to-day life to combat domestic abuse. We all know that domestic abuse training should be a core element to most social work education and training, but there's also a great deal of misinformation when it comes to patterns of abuse. We know that the training available nationwide is inconsistent as well, so some people may arrive as an ASYE, as a newly qualified with up-to-date information. Some people may have only ever touched on domestic abuse very briefly in their course, so that's why we were really keen to partner with Operation Encompass to deliver this training. As part of this webinar as well, we'll also be sharing BASWA's recent domestic abuse practice guidance. So this was written in partnership with Women's Aid and with specialist organisations such as Southall Black Sisters, Gallup, and the aim was to look at how marginalised groups, so Black and minoritised groups, LGBT groups, people who are deaf and disabled might experience domestic abuse differently and the barriers they have in getting support. So I've just pasted that in the chat. Now I'm very keen for us to get onto the interesting stuff today, so I'll just get the housekeeping out of the way really quickly. We really want to hear from you. We know that lots of you will come with knowledge and experienced and also lived experience. So please, if you've got any questions, let us know in the chat. We'll be dedicating about 10 minutes at the end for questions. And as I said earlier, if you are on Twitter, please use the hashtags to share your thoughts with us. But without any further ado, we're going to hand over to Dr. Sue Candy and Elizabeth Carney-Hayworth, who will go into much more detail than I have. So thank you both.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and it's lovely to see you all today, even though all you are is little coloured circles at the bottom of my screen. But thanks very much for joining us here today. Sue and I have worked together for a number of years around something I'll mention later on, and it's lovely to be able to share this platform with Sue. As Rebecca said, this actually came about because of your practice guide, which I accessed and saw that Operation Encompass was in there, and felt that it might be helpful if you had a wider understanding of what Operation Encompass is. And also, Sue was really, really keen to share some of her incredible expertise around the impact of domestic abuse on children. So I'm going to give a really whistle-stop tour of Operation Encompass. And I'm going to start by saying that we actually view experiencing domestic abuse as a children's rights issue. And Operation Encompass has children right at its heart. Their right to be supported, their right to be noticed, their right to be protected, their right to be heard. Frederick Douglass, the African-American reformer, he died in 1895, but his statement is as relevant today as it was then. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults. And that's the motivation behind Operation Encompass. For a moment, imagine arriving at your school the morning after you've heard and or seen one of your parents arguing and fighting with the other. You haven't slept, you've had no breakfast, your home is in disarray. You haven't got all your school uniform on, you haven't got your PE kit, you're anxious, you believe that what is happening is your fault, and now you're expected to sit in your classroom and learn. You're worried about your parents and you want to be at home, but you're also worried about what might happen when you do go home at the end of the day. You believe that what has happened is your fault and that you have no one to talk to about what's occurred or how you feel. And sadly, this is taking place in our schools every day. And without Operation Encompass, our children can be left without the support and the nurture that they need when they need it most. Operation Encompass was created from the suffering of one such child, a child that my school was trying to support without any knowledge of his living experience. No knowledge of what he went home to each night, no knowledge of what he brought with him into school each day, and no knowledge of what was there with him as he sat in his classroom, as he played out at dinner time, as he tried so hard to learn and to be successful in school. Operation Encompass is a police and education early intervention safeguarding partnership, enabling support for children and young people who are experiencing domestic abuse. And at its heart, it's information sharing as it should be. I'm not going to rehearse all the serious case reviews that there have been that have talked about the lack of information sharing. I'm not going to rehearse the fact that all the now practice reviews are saying that information sharing is still an issue. What we need to accept is that Operation Encompass now is incredibly speedy and incredibly effective information sharing, just as it should be. And information sharing that's leading to early intervention. Somebody described it as giving the key to the big door, giving us that insight into a child's life. And another person described it as the gift that keeps on giving and the best thing the police have ever given to schools. It's in every single one of the 43 police forces in England and Wales. Northern Ireland have just changed their legislation to ensure that they can implement Operation Encompass, and we're working with Ireland for them to implement it. It's in the armed forces abroad. So every school that you're working with, where you're supporting children, should be part of Operation Encompass. And if they're not, please direct them to the website, they can email us, and we can help to get them signed up with their local police force. So what are schools told? So through Operation Encompass, the police will ensure that a school is informed about all domestic abuse incidents. That's crime and non-crime. So every time an officer attends and it is deemed to be a domestic abuse incident, the school will be told. And we know that there are hundreds of thousands of domestic incidents that are not crimes. And for many years, they were just filed at source. A school will be told about all of those. They will also be told about child-to-parent abuse, and they'll be told about abuse that children are experiencing in their own teenage relationships. And through the pilots that we're running around early years, they will also be sharing that information from 28 weeks of pregnancy through to the age of 5 with health visitors, so that Operation Encompass will be covering 28 weeks of pregnancy through to 18 years of age. A school should also be told about incidents that have happened during school holidays, so that they have the understanding of what that child has experienced while they've not been in school. And during the pandemic, we have been making sure, especially during that first lockdown, that police forces still continued to actually notify schools of domestic abuse incidents. And we ask schools to offer those children places as one of their vulnerable groups. And the other thing that's key about Operation Encompass is that that information should be getting to the school prior to the start of the next school day. So that before that child even walks through the school gates, the teachers know about it. They can think about what that child has experienced, what their day might be looking like in school, how they might need to support that child, other information they have about that child and the family, so that they can consider how best to support that child. And the information should come through with enough context to enable the school to understand what that child has experienced and not to do anything that puts the adult victim or child victim at greater risk or re-traumatises them. Now, we have a new Domestic Abuse Act, and very importantly within that, children have been recognised as victims of domestic abuse in their own right. And David and I have been working for 11 years to achieve this. But now we've achieved it, people have got to consider what changes that's going to mean for their organisations. How are things going to be better? How are things going to be different for the children that they are supporting? I'll come back to that in a minute because we have written a response to this. because that recognition of children as victims comes with responsibilities upon all of us who in any way come into contact with children. We've got to change how we view and support children experiencing domestic abuse. Otherwise, these will be merely empty words. And we have to listen to what children have said they want from us. They've said that they want someone to talk to. They've said they want somebody to listen to them, including the police officers who attend these incidents of domestic abuse. They've said they want someone who will treat them as an independent person and not ask the adults about how the child might be feeling or what their reactions are. And they've said that they want to be involved in the decision-making process. They want to feel that they have some control over their lives and what is happening. And I quote a young person who was approached by his class teacher after an Operation Encompass call. And the child turned to the teacher, and the teacher actually said he could see his shoulders go down. He could feel the stress kind of go out of the child. And he just said to him, well, thank goodness there's somebody I can talk to at last. We know, and this is historical data, but it hasn't been updated, that on average there are 35 incidents of domestic abuse before a call is ever made to the police. And so one of the things that we stress to schools is that if they receive an Operation Encompass notification, and it's the first one for that child or the first one for that family, that they actually think to themselves, well, this is very unlikely to be a one-off. This child, this family could have experienced this for 34 or more times, but this is just the first time that the police have been called and we've been told. So it's trying to understand the actual living experience of our children. And the reason we pass that information on to schools, because we know that schools are in an incredibly unique position to offer immediate support to these children. Schools can be that necessary early intervention, providing safe, secure, nurturing relationships within a safe, secure and nurturing environment. And on that, they can build strong and trusting connections with the child and their family. And for many of our children experiencing domestic abuse, the support that their school offers them may be the only support that they ever have. But we're really keen at Operation Encompass to make sure that schools realise they are not on their own in this, and they have access to a huge range of support and resources from our website. And every single thing we have on our website and every single training event that we run as Operation Encompass is free. I want to do a really quick tour of what we have, because these are things that you can make sure your schools are aware of. And I know you're going to get a handout after this that actually has some of the detail of this on it. We have online training for all school staff, totally free, and it's CPD registered. And that talks about the impact of domestic abuse, the impact on children, how that might look in a school setting, and the ways that schools can support those children. And as I say, over 8,500 people have already done that training, and it's absolutely free. And all staff can do it, not just teachers, all staff, governors, everybody can do it. We also have the Operation Encompass helpline, which actually Sue and her colleagues answer the calls. And we created that in the first lockdown. And that means that if a teacher is concerned that a child is experiencing domestic abuse, is unsure about how they might support them, or just wants to talk through the ways as a school that they are currently supporting their children experiencing domestic abuse, they literally pick up the phone, and it's 8 till 1 o'clock, and the call is answered by an educational or clinical psychologist. There is no waiting list, there is no paperwork, there is no threshold. All we need is a teacher to think, I'd just like to talk to somebody about this, and they're straight through to them. We've got a wide range of guides or handbooks that are there, again, free to download. So one's about how schools and police can implement Operation Encompass. There's one about schools recognising children experiencing domestic abuse as one of their vulnerable groups that they carefully track as they go through school. There's a booklet as well about how to teach the domestic abuse strand of that new relationships education. And with that, there are book reviews that have been undertaken by Sue's staff for us. And there's a booklet about how schools can actually support children once they've had that call. There's a range of videos that Sue's staff has done for us. And there are lots and lots of day-to-day resources, such as the statements that they can put about being an Operation Encompass school in their safeguarding policy, and posters so that the whole school community knows they're an Operation Encompass school. But we're not asking our schools to be counsellors or therapists. I said to you that we'd done a response to children being recognised as victims in their own right. And about this time last year, we published it, and it's called Hear My Voice. And that again is on the website. And in there are recommendations to the Home Office, DfE, police, schools, judiciary and social care about some of the things we can think of that we need to address now that children are recognised in this way. So we've talked about the fact that we need to count the number of children. We kind of do a finger in the air. We don't actually know how many children are experiencing domestic abuse. Things like immediate speech and language therapy assessments and then intervention if it's needed. Support and recognition of the role of DSLs within school and greater training for them. And I note actually that the DfE has kind of picked up on that. All DSLs always invited to MARACs. Free full-time nursery places for children who are experiencing domestic abuse. Children who lose a parent to a domestic homicide being recognised as special orphans and the range of support around that. And experiencing domestic abuse recognised as a children's rights issue, as we do. Within that guide, there is also the Child's Victim Support Code, which talks about the basic rights that children should have. That's been adopted by a number of police forces, and the National Association of Head Teachers has actually asked schools to adopt that. We've also written that in Children Speak that can be displayed around school and can be used as part of those relationships education sessions led in school. And we've also created a continuum of support that children should be able to expect from us when they're experiencing domestic abuse. And as I say, there's a whole guidance around how to teach that domestic abuse thread of the new relationships and sex education. Now, that has been an incredibly whistle-stop tour of what Operation Encompass is, but hopefully all the schools you work with are already part. But as I say, if they're not, please make sure that they come to us so that we can get them signed up. I am more than happy to come back at any point and do, you know, a much bigger piece about what Operation Encompass does and our reach. But I want to finish by saying, and I'm going to revert to an African proverb, which is that the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And for far too long, I think our children experiencing domestic abuse and other trauma, distress and fear in their lives have been left with no other option than to metaphorically burn down our communities and our schools in an effort to get us to see them, to hear their voice and to feel their pain. And I'm now going to hand over to Sue so that we can think about the damage done to our children who are experiencing domestic abuse. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. So I'm a clinical psychologist who has the privilege of being part of Psychology Associates who are supporting Operation Encompass with things like the helpline and various other things. I am just going to try and multitask and to keep talking whilst I load up a presentation, and we'll go a bit like Liz. I will also be going at quite a pace. Now, we've already helped you understand a bit about Operation Encompass, but we also want you to really understand how domestic violence and abuse does impact on children through their childhood. And we also need to help you understand a bit of the neurobiology and some of then the indicators that they may be being abused. Now, Liz has already addressed this, and please do have a look at their website. It's excellent. I also am definitely on a whistle-stop tour here to try and give you as much information as possible. And I want you just to think about the different developmental stages that a child goes through, from being in utero through their infancy, that first up to 2 years of age, toddlerhood, primary school and their older school. And when I talk about adolescents, I'm using the World Health Organization definition, which is between 12 and 24 years. And that is because of what happens neurobiologically during that time. That's how we now view adolescence. And just before I move forward, I want you to stop and think, which of those developmental stages does research suggest, if you experience abuse, has the biggest impact? And it might surprise you to note that actually in utero, there is significant damage caused to the fetus, to the unborn baby. And we often forget this. But also pregnancy is a real trigger for domestic abuse. In fact, 30% of the violence and abuse starts in pregnancy. Also, existing abuse can worsen during that period, and we know that actually things will continue. If a domestic abuse is present, then up to 60% of women still experience it during their pregnancy. It is a very high risk time. We also know that there's huge risks. There's risks of miscarriage, infection, premature birth, low birth weight, injury, death to the baby. But it also goes on beyond that. Now, we know that there are harmful birth outcomes, but also the baby's early development is affected, and the very way in which their brain is structured and their neurological development. Equally, the mother's emotional state influences the baby's development and will affect their mental health in the future. Now, I'll talk a little bit more of that in a moment, but one of the biggest ways it impacts is on the attachment relationship. Now, I am certain that as an audience, you will know what I mean when I talk about attachment, but I'm going to give you a very quick refresher, because we hope that children experience secure attachment. They have a carer that's utterly reliable, will meet that child's needs. And as the infant and baby develops, it will come to trust that the mother or father or carer will meet their needs. So the 10-month-old baby will be happy to sit in a high chair waiting for their food, because they know that their parent, if they're going through that process of looking like they're preparing food, that food will come. And in secure attachment, if we think of attachment as a piece of elastic, that piece of elastic will stretch in an age-appropriate way. So once the child is 5 and is in a play park, it will be able to tolerate, if no one's there and it's quiet, the parent or carer sitting on the park bench whilst they go up and down and around on the slide. But if a big dog or older children and strangers enter that park, the piece of elastic will draw that child back to the parent. And if there's attachment security, once the child's back with the parent, the child will get a dose of oxytocin and feel good and safe, and so will the carer. But then we have attachment insecurity. So ambivalent attachment, where sometimes the carer is available and wants to give the child a hug, but at other times they don't, maybe because they're watching EastEnders or something else is in the way. Maybe they're anxious and concerned that they may be hit or hurt or abused by the partner. And in this case, that piece of elastic, the child learns to keep the elastic short. They want to be with the parent all the time, because out of sight might be out of mind. They make their emotions big, they're clingy, they're whingy. And if they were at the play park, and they wouldn't even allow the carer to sit on the bench. They would need the carer right next to them in order to access the slide. But we may also have avoidant attachment, where the carer is pretty rejecting to the child all the time, and the piece of elastic becomes very stretched because the child has to meet their own needs, and the child may prioritize the adult's needs and try and please the adult and be pseudo mature. So that piece of elastic having got stretched, if they were in the play park, well, if a big dog came into the park or older children, they'd simply climb to the top of the slide. They would look after themselves. And then if we have disorganized attachment, and this is common in domestic abuse, because the carer is an actual source of fear and threat. And because the parent is frightening, the child doesn't have a piece of elastic that's reliable. They just do not know what to do. And these are the children that we worry about the most. Now, if we have that situation of attachment insecurity, the impact becomes even greater. And if we think of how might we know that an infant has experienced domestic abuse, well, we should have thoughts in our head because of the link between abuse and low birth weight when babies are premature, low birth weight, but also when they're really difficult to settle and to soothe because of the difficulties that will arise with attachment. There could be problems with feeding, or the baby may be quite withdrawn, rarely cries. They may, when they're held, physically pull away, arch their back. Now, of course, there are other reasons why babies may present in this way, but one of the things we should be thinking about is domestic abuse. Now, there are lots of indicators that a child might be experiencing domestic abuse. So moving forward beyond infancy now. I'm not going to read all these through. They're there for you to look at and for you to consider. I simply don't have enough time today to identify each one. And again, all of these indicators could be the result of all sorts of different trauma, abuse, some of them also because of physical health issues. But part of the checklist that we all need to have as professionals is to think about domestic abuse, especially if you become aware that police have been involved, Operation Encompass have been involved with a child, then, and they are displaying some of these symptoms, then we know that we're dealing with these issues. Now, some of the indicators are a bit different in adolescents. And remember, I'm using that age 12 to 24 age range because of what happens in people's brains at that time. So again, these could be the result of other things, but we need to be thinking, okay, maybe these are indicators of domestic abuse. And adolescence, you know, it's a really important time, and we can get things wrong with adolescence. It's a time when there is a lot of synaptic pruning going on in the adolescent's brain. So if to think of an example, you know, when you're a little child, you learn about Father Christmas, and initially you might lay down a synaptic connection. It's just a bit like a little pathway, but over a few magical years that pathway grows and it might become a lane and then a B road and then like an A road in your adolescent brain. But you know, by the time you get into your adolescence, you realize Father Christmas isn't real. So that synaptic connection is no longer used. Now, there's lots of different connections like that. And in adolescence, what happens is the brain goes through a process. It sends out little mitochondria, almost come out with their scissors, and they start pruning all of the synaptic connections that aren't needed anymore. And those synaptic connections are cut away, and then the ones that remain are organised so that we have motorways and superhighways rather than lanes and B roads. Now, this process in adolescence is such an opportunity to intervene and to help. And although adolescents, because of all of the things that are happening to them, hormonally, but also neurologically, they can appear to be difficult to reach, but they can be reached. And we mustn't be put off by their initial presentation, where they can act like they don't want to talk. And I think maybe especially sometimes if you're a professional and a social worker. But we must see beyond that, and we must just ask the questions and listen. We also know that they will be much more likely to discuss and to disclose if the domestic abuse that they're experiencing started once some attachment security had been established. Generally, it's more difficult for children of any age to talk about their emotions if they are experiencing attachment insecurity. So what happens in the brains of children during their development, and how does that link with domestic abuse? Well, our brains, we have brilliant neuroplasticity, which means that the brain can still mold and develop its ability to change its structure because of things it's experiencing. Now, the bad news, if you're heading for 60 like myself, is that that lessens with age. But when you're little and young as a child, there's opportunities and there are critical windows that are particularly important. So the brain can change well prior to the age of 4, and because of the synaptic pruning I just spoke about, during adolescence. So those are the reasons why, though they are particularly critical time periods. And, you know, the synaptic connections, that pruning period to get rid of the synaptic connections that are unhelpful, is a time when we certainly should be able to intervene much better. Now, to understand what happens neurologically, I have to mention these 2 decision-making routes that we have as human beings. Now, one of the oldest parts of our brain is called our limbic system. And this is system 1. It is where we have our unconscious emotion. It is involuntary and it's very fast. What you feel is valid. You can't stop your feelings. And it's generated in the main from that limbic system. And then we have our incredible clever brains, our conscious thinking. Now, the processing here is much slower. It's more controlled, and it follows clear rules in how it's accessed. And this is fundamental to understanding some of the impact that domestic abuse can have on brain development. So we have our system 1 that's very fast, and our system 2 that's fairly slow. And I'll come back to this and build on this as we go. Okay. So areas of the brain that get most affected by domestic abuse within the home are our clever brain, the prefrontal cortex, and our emotional brain, the limbic system, which has more structures in it than this, but these are the main ones: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then the ones I'm going to talk about today, the amygdala and the hippocampus. And there is another structure that's really important called the corpus callosum. And all of these are affected when domestic abuse occurs, even when the baby is as yet unborn and still in utero. So just having a quick look at this brain, we can see the limbic system, and we can see the amygdala. There's actually two, one on each side, and you'll see labelled up in white something called the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum is a bridge between the two hemispheres and also facilitates communication between our emotional brain and our clever brain. You will also see the hippocampus, which curls around and takes messages from the amygdala through to our clever brain. So just thinking a bit more about our limbic system, which is our emotional brain. Now, unfortunately, this part of our brain is really susceptible to high levels of the stress hormone called cortisol because it's neurotoxic, and that includes when the baby is still in the womb. Now, cortisol gets released in an adult when they are experiencing domestic abuse. So if the mother is feeling stressed and is being abused, she will release cortisol, which will then have a neurotoxic impact in large quantities on the baby she is carrying. And this is important to understand, and why we have to particularly care about and worry about pregnant mothers who are experiencing abuse. Now, the hippocampus, which is an amazing part, it's very important for processing our memory, especially episodic, which is our sort of autobiographical memory. So what happened today? And what happens in the hippocampus is, as we go through the day, our memory of what's happening gets stored in the hippocampus. When we sleep, it gets transferred into our other memory storage, and which we can then access at other times. Now, when the hippocampus gets flooded with cortisol, which it does when our bodies go into emotional threat, the hippocampus blocks and our memory of the day gets quite confused. And that's why we see victims of significant trauma. Very good research about women who've been raped often do not recall exactly what has happened and how it has happened. And that is because in threat, the amygdala releases high levels of cortisol, which blocks the hippocampus, and the memory is not clear. We may have other ways of remembering it clearly, our sense of smell, for example, and in a sensory way, but that episodic, the autobiographical, the narrative is not laid down in the same way. And the hippocampus is really important for regulating emotion and stress, also for being able to think and have spatial processing. We know that high levels of quality care from a mother will increase the glucoid receptors, which actually helps to protect the child's hippocampus. And again, it's very hard for a parent receiving and being involved in domestic abuse to maintain that high quality of care. So the child is at risk of damage to the hippocampus. Now, we also see the hippocampus causes and results in high levels of dissociation and the lack of being able to really integrate and make sense in a coherent way about things that have happened. In severe cases, it can really cause an inability to remember events at all. So there's an importance to understand that early chronic stress can end up affecting virtually every area of our development. Now, the other part of the limbic system that I want to mention today is the amygdala. And the amygdala is our threat system. This is the part of our brain that will respond to fear. It's our survival system. It is the part of the brain that will keep us safe. And interestingly, if I just go back to the picture here, it is the amygdala that affects what system, whether it's system 1, which is our emotional brain, or system 2 that is operating. Because when the amygdala senses danger and goes into threat, it blocks the hippocampus. So it cuts off your system 1, your clever brain. And it does that for good reason, because in a crisis, something that feels life-threatening, danger and threat, as humans, we don't have the luxury of going to our clever brains because our clever brains are too slow. If we were suddenly faced with a gunman in front of us, we can't go to our clever brain because our clever brain will start asking questions. Is that man in fancy dress? Am I in danger? How did they get in? And we could by then be shot. So what happens is our system, our amygdala, doesn't allow that to happen. It keeps us safe by keeping it all within our emotional brain, by stopping access to our clever brain, by blocking the hippocampus with that stress hormone of cortisol. It also, while it's at it, cuts off the anterior cingulate, which is the area of the brain that is our motivation for empathy for ourselves and for others. So in other words, when we're in absolute threat, we don't have empathy for others, and we can't access our clever brains with our reflections, our problem solving. We just act, and we are likely to flight and run off, fight, or play dead as a way of coping. And that is really important because that's how the amygdala should work. But if your amygdala has been damaged because you've been exposed to early abuse and domestic abuse and shouting and violence, your amygdala will become oversensitive. And rather than it just triggering that process of threat when there is very real threat, it will do it and become oversensitive and will go into threat at the slightest trigger. So children who have experienced these difficulties will get triggered and dysregulate very easily, or shut down and dissociate and withdraw very easily because their system gets triggered far too easily. Now, our clever brains, our prefrontal cortex, enables us to draw on long-term goals and ideas rather than just being in the moment. It helps with complex planning, with problem solving, moderating our behaviour, reflection, decision making, self-control. And you've got to imagine for a lot of children who've experienced domestic abuse, if they haven't been helped and it hasn't been stopped, they will have significant periods of time where they cannot access all of these things because their amygdala will go into threat too easily. The prefrontal cortex also has this really extended sensitive period. So it's no good just thinking we have to stop domestic abuse in the very early years, because the prefrontal cortex is growing and changing all the way through childhood. So whenever there is domestic abuse, we have seen in research differences in the amount of cortical grey matter in the prefrontal cortex, and that occurs even at birth. We also know that there's poor executive functioning when domestic abuse has happened. Dysregulation is likely to be a pretty constant occurrence. And dysregulation may mean also that shutdown, not just acting out. It also has a long-term, even lifelong impact, because it's setting that child up for mental health problems in the future. And I have to mention the corpus callosum again. And if you remember, that is the part of the brain where we have the bridge between the two hemispheres and between the clever brain and the emotional brain. So the corpus callosum, it connects these different hemispheres. We need it for good communication and for the brain to work as one. When trauma occurs, and domestic abuse is a significant interpersonal trauma, it reduces the size of the corpus callosum. And therefore, the child has difficulty with the overall brain functioning. We also, because of poor myelination, we have the dissociation occurs. Now, studies have shown that at birth, a mother who has experienced domestic abuse, her baby is born, and the corpus callosum, even at birth, is less dense and smaller than it should be. In other words, there are already less intense connections in that corpus callosum, and those problems continue and are seen throughout childhood. Hello? Hello, is everything all right?
Yes. So okay, carry on. I've just muted one of the attendees. Sorry about that, Sue.
Oh, okay, thank you. Great. So this is really helpful, I think, this quote about the corpus callosum. So by preventing integration of sensory stimuli, by inhibiting communication between brain regions, lateralization heightens arousal in emotional reactive areas, leading to increased behavioural problems and dissociative symptoms in traumatized children. And we can't underestimate the damage that can be caused by this process. So, you know, what do these changes in brain development mean? Well, we end up with over or under responsiveness to emotional situations. So this is the almost like ambivalent attachment or avoidant attachment and disorganized attachment. We have hyperarousal or numbing, and we have avoidance and re-experiencing. And that initial trauma, it alters the stress system so that in the future, things get perceived as threatening, even if they're not. And this can lead to terrible misdiagnoses for children. So they can get labelled as having autism, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder when they don't. And it matters because what you do to help those children is very different depending on us really understanding what the issues are for that child. So the structural damage that can be caused to a child's brain because of domestic abuse can lead to problems with memory, spatial processing, attention, executive function, and delayed cognitive development, language, and motor function delays. You know, this is huge. We can also end up with developmental trauma disorder, where we see the difficulties with attachment, the biological problems, sensory, motor related, emotional regulation difficulties, altered awareness dissociation, problems with managing their behavior, cognition. They will not do as well at school, they will underachieve, and also how they see themselves. The very nature of their self-concept will be damaged. I have to also say that we have to remember that to be a good quality parent, you have to have an environment that facilitates that. And an adult victim of domestic abuse is highly likely to be struggling emotionally and physically. And therefore, they're not going to be able to prioritise the child because their own adult needs are too overwhelming. So they may be a perfectly good parent if there was no domestic abuse, and they could offer their child safety in those circumstances. But in the absence of that, there's likely to be blocked care. The parent is unlikely to be able to do what is needed for the child in those circumstances. So, you know, what can we all do as professionals? Well, please always remember, ask the difficult questions. And I don't want to teach any of you to suck eggs because you're all professionals and experienced. But we have to also begin to find out, when did the domestic abuse start? Because if this was ongoing whilst the child was in utero, the damage, if it has continued for a long time, is likely to be greater. And children will often look absolutely fine, and they will tell us that they're fine, especially those who are being pseudo-mature and are minimizing their own emotional needs. But we need to observe behavior and the emotion that they're expressing rather than what they tell us. Also, we really want to notice the home atmosphere. And you know what? Notice your gut reaction. If you feel uncomfortable, we've got to think why. And our gut reactions, they come from our emotional brains. And there's things that we can't pick up with our clever brains, like our heartbeat, which has an electromagnetic field of 5 meters. Therefore, if you're in a home talking to a parent and they're feeling anxious, well, your emotional brain can probably pick up something about their heart rate. Your clever brain can't access it, but you may feel something, a level of discomfort yourself. That's your gut reaction. And for years, we've been told as professionals that gut reactions somehow are bad because they will make us feel that they're open to prejudice, built on our belief systems that may be flawed. But we need to not ignore those things, because we're increasingly understanding that our emotional brain is picking things up that our clever brain can't. So we've got to ask why and start to ask questions when our gut reaction is telling us something isn't right. It might not be abuse, but notice it. And children being pseudo-mature and prioritizing their parents' needs, that isn't normal. Children are normally selfish. They're meant to be. That is the way that they are built and the way that they develop. Please speak to nursery schools, gather more information, be aware of Operation Encompass. All of those things are vital. And never, never, never assume someone else is addressing the domestic abuse issues. And we've seen time and time again in serious incident reviews, it always comes down to it being unclear who was responsible. And we all need to be responsible. We've got to build the relationships with the children and inquire sensitively, use curiosity, create opportunity, quiet environments where we can assure some confidentiality. We've got to know about those local domestic violence agencies. We've got to focus on safety, assess the immediate safety of the parent and the child, recognising the child as a victim in their own right. We've got to record our suspicions of domestic abuse. We've got to share that with our supervisors. We've got to share information appropriately, got to understand the importance of why we're reporting, and constantly recognise the needs of that unborn child and the child remain paramount and critical. Now, I have included, but I don't have time to go through it, some of the research, but it is there for you to look at. We are getting better and better information and research that helps us to understand the impact upon babies in utero and through their childhood, the devastating impact that it can have on their very way in which their brain is wired. So I hope that this complete whistle-stop tour has focused you in on why Operation Encompass and clinicians like myself at Psychology Associates, and why all professionals need to really recognise why the impact of domestic abuse and violence is so significant. Here are some contact details. You will get access to a handout of these slides. Please give some feedback, which will be helpful to Liz and I for the future. And I am now going to stop screen. I'm going to try stop presenting. There we go. And thank you, and ask whether you have any questions for Liz and I.
Thank you both so much. I just want to quickly jump in and say you introduced this as something that would be a whistle-stop tour. I think I speak on behalf of everyone here when I say I've learned more in the past hour than I did in my whole career as a social worker about certain parts of, child development and domestic abuse. And I think you've really highlighted the importance of early intervention going right back to pregnancy. And also, I really liked your distinction between the emotional brain and the clever brain. And I think you're right, there's been an over focus of, almost pseudo-intellectualism and really only relying on one part of our brain, and we are thinking and feeling human beings. And I will definitely take that away and go back to trusting my body and trusting my instincts. So thank you so much. And I really wish that every social worker in the country was here. We need everybody to be aware, and we will be sharing the recording. So if there's anyone here who thinks my team could really benefit from this, don't worry, we will be sending the recording as well as all of the resources. Now, we have gone over time. We said that we'd stop at 1, but I think it's really important to allow just 5 minutes space for any questions, if that's okay with the two of you, if you don't have to rush off. While we wait for questions, I'm going to kick off and just say very simply, could you maybe give us an example of good and bad practice that you've seen from social workers?
Ooh.
When it comes to supporting victims of domestic abuse?
Let's.
Yeah, I can think of both, and they actually with the same lad. So he was a a 14-year-old lad who'd been exposed to domestic abuse in utero and throughout his life, and he was getting into all sorts of trouble, youth offending team, the lot. He also looked like he was about 18. The way that he protected himself was he came across pretty aggressively to everybody, and he was really difficult. When I first started to, I was doing an expert opinion report for the courts. He had a lot of younger children as well, and I went and saw I had a really bad account of him from the social worker, his first social worker, who was very negative, told me, do not allow him in the house when you go and observe the family, because he is horrible and threatening and rude and swears and is vile, and you will feel very uncomfortable. And I was actually really taken aback by the comments from the social worker. They were so negative. I insisted that he's part of the family. He's only 14, and I'm assessing him for the court. I want to see the family together. I observed a kind, gentle, lovely lad playing with his baby sister and various other children younger than him, and caring for them, feeding them, being lovely. And I reported this immediately, actually, my concerns about the negativity from the social worker. And very unusually, because it doesn't happen often, the social worker was changed. And I saw excellent practice from the new social worker, who took the time and trouble to actually take him out. I think they went and had an ice cream and went for a walk. Walking is good because it settles the emotional brain rhythm. Our emotional brain, our amygdalas like swaying, they like rhythm. And he was calm and he disclosed all sorts, which actually incredibly gave valuable evidence to the local authority for them to take the action they needed to protect all of them, which they wouldn't have got if that social worker hadn't seen beyond the bravado.
That's incredibly powerful. Thank you so much. Liz, did you also have anything to add?
I have recently retired after 42 years in education, most of it in schools. And so I have, sadly, I've worked with a lot of social workers, most of whom I have to say have been absolutely tremendous. I suppose my sadness would be when dealing with cases of domestic abuse, when if the mother was the adult victim, when the responsibility has been put on her. That she has to do something, she has to leave that relationship to secure the safety of those children. And I think, I know we've moved on, and I would hope that that was never the situation, but that is very, very difficult when you're trying to support a family. And that situation, you find that that's the situation for the mother. But I don't think we're there. I think I've seen, and Sue mentioned this, a kind of rush to diagnose children as ADHD or autistic because of the way they're behaving. But actually, there's so much else going on that's not appropriate, because, as Sue said, it doesn't actually get the children the help and the support that they actually need to deal with the domestic abuse. But, it's... As I say, I've also worked with some absolutely tremendous social workers who have really understood that this is about supporting the whole family within this domestic abuse situation. I can see somebody who said there about, is there any advice about the sort of questions to use with your children when talking about DVA? I'm trying to read the rest of that. Is it
possible to have your email address?
Yes, our email address, I'll put it in. Absolutely, I'll put that in. Do you want to talk about the questions, Sue?
Because I don't think it is easy.
No.
But there are some if we're talking about little e's here, because it says younger children in that particular question from Emily, there are some great resources on the Operation Encompass website. There are a number of books. So what I do as a clinician, I take a storybook. There's one in particular that I like. It is one of the ones that is in the book review, something like anyway, I can't remember its title, but it's about a bear and the bear's parents argue, and it's about how to support. Now, in my experience, children who have experienced domestic violence, you get to about page 3 and they say, that's my mummy and daddy. And they're like a very easy disclosure from that. But children don't respond well to direct questioning. Children little children need play. They need a lightness. So rather than so long as you've got a few resources, and I've seen social workers with great resources, I think that the knack is you have to be light, because when you are light, it enables you to go serious and deep into a conversation. So don't be afraid. You know, domestic abuse and violence is horrid, and it is a serious topic, but you cannot be serious in the way that you talk to little children. You have to give a lightness to it. Now, you can also say, oh, that oh, that must make you sad if they tell you. And I would then carry on for a bit and I'd say, let's see what else happens to little bear. So there are some great resources that are available. There are also a whole range of sort of workbooks. Karen Treisman and her treasure trove of resources have lots of things that are applicable here. But it's about not being afraid to follow up the questions. And of course, social workers need to evidence things, and therefore you can't be leading. It has to come from the child, but you can offer the child the opportunity.
And I was going to add to that, Sue. I often found, especially in school, that I used to do this with parents as well as with children, is actually making sure that you're working alongside rather than opposite, and drawing. Having, huge sheets of paper. I would always make sure that I took kind of, the A3 sheets of paper, not tiny ones, and just lots of different coloured pens, and let them draw, and just chatting with them about, you'll find so much if you ask them about, like the routines of their day. What do you do when you get up? So the child is talking and drawing, and you're drawing, and you will find that they will draw incredible things, and they will tell you things because they're feeling very at ease, because in a sense they're doing something with you rather than you specifically asking them questions.
Thank you so much. I'm just so grateful for your wisdom and the time that you spent with us today. I'm just very conscious, as we need to come to a close now, that I have so many questions. I'm sure other people do. And as BAS, we're really trying to understand, engage from our members. What is it that you're after? Is it workshops? Is it, would you prefer kind of sessions where there's less of you, or case study reflections? How best can we partner with people like Sue and Liz again in the future in a way that would be meaningful? So do get in touch with us. As I said, this excellent resource, this recording will be made available. We're also going to send links to both Operation Encompass and Psychology Associates.
You've gone on mute.
Oh no,
Yeah.
thank you. I was wondering, was I on mute the whole time? For anyone who missed it, our domestic abuse guidance, which covers how to support marginalised survivors, so those who are deaf, disabled, LGBT+, Black and minoritised, is there. It's a really easy resource that you can flick through on your lunch break. It's, something you can dip in and out of. But as we draw to a close, just thank you all so much. I hope, listen, Sue, this won't be the end of our conversation, and that we can continue to support social workers together. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody who's attended today.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye.
bye everybody.
Bye everybody. Thank you.